Hi, and welcome to this episode of Sports Science Insights with me, Steve Barrett. And I'm joined today by guest Dr. Michael King from the University of Glasgow. And we'll be diving into the area of talent ID within sports science as well. So, Mike, thank you for joining us as well today. Loving the guitars in the background as well. So, depending on how well this podcast goes, we might hear a song by the end of it. Who knows?
Yeah, I need to maybe bring out my alter ego.
It'd be good just to get a bit of a brief introduction about you and your career so far, if that's all right, and how your journey through sports science has been, if that's all right with you, to start off the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, y- you've already said that I work at the University of Glasgow. That's only a recent move for me, starting there in June 2024. So far, it's been pretty good. I started in 2008 studying through in Dundee at Aberdeen. Studied a kind of broad sport and exercise science degree, specialising in physical activity and health, ultimately, for my honours year. And then went on to do a sort of Masters by Research degree in sport-related discipline. And then leaving that to go into to study a PhD in sport and exercise physiology. And I think after every stage of studying, after honours, I thought I'm never doing that again because I had to sort of maximise my time, push myself to the limit, did really well academically and thought that's it for me. I was out it probably for about 3 or 4 months, got the opportunity to do the master's degree, master's by research, and thought, no, I think I've got a little bit more left. Again, pushed myself to the limit with that, got it, thought that's me, done with studying. And then the opportunity came up to do a fully funded PhD in collaboration with the Football Association in Scotland. And I thought, I'll kick myself if I don't take that. It probably wasn't exactly what I wanted to do at that time, but I knew I kind of had to, and I knew it would be good for me. All those things kind of came about, those sort of connections with the Scottish Football Association, because I had started to volunteer within their performance programme. So I initially just, again, by chance, it was a conversation with my parents actually. They'd get the local paper in Kilmarnock and said they were putting what was called a performance school into the high school that I had gone to as a student. So, they'd given a bit of information about it in the paper and I read about it. I looked up the coach online, who was Andy Goldie at the time. Got in touch with him and he said, yeah, why don't you come out and have a little look? And it just honestly started out by me just standing at the side of the pitch and watching what was going on. And then gradually I was allowed to lift the cones and sort of do that sort of stuff. And that never really changed actually, but no, he was great taking me in and then getting me involved in other aspects of the programme, the likes of the one through in Glasgow, with Brian McLaughlin, who it was at the time before he moved into his new role. And I was doing a lot of sort of work with them and just helping out generally. And then we looked at what the programme didn't really have, and that was any sort of element of sports science, any sort of element of focus on physical preparation. It is very much a technical programme, and it's about individual player development, but there wasn't really a focus on any kind of testing, tracking, monitoring, anything like that. And I had, throughout my honours degree in particular, I'd done a lot of coaching, sort of collected coaching badges and applied them as well, worked in pro youth academies and worked in communities and mini kickers, antisocial behaviour prevention, coaching in disability groups, and loved that. But I think always kind of knew that I wanted to try and be involved in performance sport. I knew I was never going to be good enough to play it. So I thought that would be a good way to stay involved. So the opportunity, because I had got myself involved with the performance setup, came up for that PhD collaboration with them. I applied for it and was offered it and thought it'd be crazy to turn that down. That kind of led into a job in football full time, which I enjoyed. It was really good. I learned a lot from it, not just the applied side, but also the politics and dealing with people and all that side of it, which was fantastic. Then decided to make the move into working in academia, which again was really good for me, very different. I had done a little bit of lecturing and guest speaking and stuff like that, but to go into it full time was quite different. And I think I'm infinitely better at my job as an academic because I've done it in the real world. And as well as that, because I've been able to remain involved with the national setup and work as an applied sports scientist with the national team throughout that time, and still retain that, makes me infinitely better at my job because I'm not de-skilling almost. I'm still doing it. I'm still in the field and I'm still applying what I'm trying to teach. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded. But
No, it's great, and it shows you, like, I think sometimes people undervalue and can underappreciate like what everyone goes through to get to where they are currently in like the sports science field. Like, it's fascinating to hear like what do you kind of see as like the difference between sports science like now to when you first started? Because again, picking cones up, I don't think we teach that on sports science modules now, do we? So like, but that's obviously an element of your practice as a sports scientist that helped you establish where you were. So yeah, it'd be good to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not by any means a hugely experienced practitioner. I've been involved for a while, but I don't consider myself to be a sort of part of the old guard. Absolutely not. There's people out there that are far more experienced than me, but even in the time I have been involved, it's changed a lot. I think the easy access to things like GPS monitoring and monitor a physical load, and even the openness from coaches to let that sort of stuff happen, as well as physical testing. I felt that even when I started to try and implement stuff like that, was almost a little bit, why are we doing this? Not really sure of it. And that's absolutely fine. That's no problem. But I don't think it was as common, particularly with younger players, because I wasn't doing it with first teams to begin with, where we were trying to win 3 points on a Saturday. I was trying to convince coaches to test players because it would help us understand where they might be in 10, 12, 15 years. And that, to me, wasn't particularly common. I don't think to the coaches I was working with was particularly common. They hadn't maybe seen much of that. And it wasn't that easy to convince them about why it was important. And you're trying to take time off them on the pitch. You're trying to take training sessions. You're trying to stop kids playing football so that you can test them physically. And that's not always an easy sale. So I think that side of it's definitely changed. I think now that's much more sort of commonly accepted, that's part of it. And not always necessarily in a good way. I think we've maybe swung so far on the pendulum that we test too much. We test for testing's sake. There's so many touch points in a day. Maybe not so much in adolescent football, where they're maybe in for a couple of hours a few nights a week. But certainly in full-time football, whether that's B teams, reserve teams, 23s or first teams, so many touch points that just get accepted. It's just the players come in and they'll have to do a wellbeing questionnaire, then they'll have to do a hydration assessment, then they'll have to pick up their GPS unit, and then they'll have to this, and sometimes it's too much. I think we've gone so far in the other direction, we risk it being too much. So I think that's the big difference. It's gone from a case of you having to constantly justify what you're doing, almost it becoming common ground, but too familiar for some people.
Do you think that's because, again, it must be hard, like teaching like some of the students you've got now, like sports science in general, because ultimately, like you kind of become a generalist as well within sports science, so you have to go across disciplines as well. Like, for example, in your day-to-day kind of operation, when you're with like the Scottish FA, for example, on camp, what kind of roles do you have as a sports scientist? Like that you feel are sports science related, but also not sports science related. So picking cones up, for example.
No, it's a great point, and it's one that I think I said earlier, it made me infinitely better at my job as an academic, coming from the background of working in full-time sport. And I mean that in a sense that we might teach things, and I've said it before in universities. I worked through in Napier and Edinburgh, worked at University of West of Scotland, and now work at Glasgow. We teach students using the best of equipment. We take them in lovely big labs, environmental chambers. We teach them how to use Douglas bags. We'll put them on, the gas analyzers, ergonomics, brilliant stuff. Cybets is the students using DEXA scanners and stuff, which is fantastic. It's great. And it's brilliant to get your hands on that sort of stuff. But when you go into practice, that kind of stuff's not there. 99% of the time, that kind of stuff's not there. And I think the part that sometimes students are disillusioned by is you learn doing all that stuff, and then you go into practice and think there's no DEXA scanners here, there's no gas analyzers, there's nothing, and coaches want me to give them information, so they don't see the real part of it, where you're having to think, well, the coach wants to know how people are getting fitter. I would have been told to do that by analysing VO2 max, just broadly, for example. So I need to get some sort of proxy measure of that. What's the best way to do that? Okay, we could use a field test. So which field test? And then how do you know that that test is reliable? How do you know it's telling what you want it to tell you? And how valid is it? And where does that come from? Is the research been conducted in a similar environment with similar athletes of a similar age or gender, or so there's a whole process that I think that I certainly try to get across to the students, that this looks great in here, and of course this is how it would work in a perfect world, but you have to be ready for what's coming when you don't have any of that stuff and you still need to get some information. And then, as I mentioned before, how do you know when you've gone too far? Are you collecting information for the sake of it? Because if you're collecting information, it doesn't tell you anything, and it's not going to make the athletes any better. To me, you're as well not wasting your time collecting it. There's all the bits in there that the students don't see, the likes of picking up cones, filling up water bottles, arriving before people, leaving after people, cleaning GPS vests in the bath so that they're ready for when you go out in the morning, because the kit turnaround's not close enough. So my role on a national squad is everything from getting up in the morning and maybe doing, if it is health and well-being and hydration assessments first thing, making sure food's appropriate, food's out, and the players have what they want, to then sorting out training groups, who's maybe played a little bit and who hasn't, who maybe needs to do more, and that also comes in from the clubs when they want them doing extras. So we have to tie that in with what the coaches want, because they obviously need to get out of it what they want as well. And then setting up GPS units, making sure that they're switched on, ready to go, which still goes wrong incredibly, no matter how many times you do it, still goes wrong. During the session, taking a warm-up on the pitch, maybe working with individuals who are working separately, downloading data after the session, maybe leading cool downs, taking pool recovery, taking any gym sessions or top-up things. Again, you're back to food, you're back for lunch or you're back for dinner. That needs to be checked to make sure everyone's got what they want. You're downloading it, the data, putting it into reports, sending it to coaches, making sure it's available for clubs, making sure that individuals who want to see their data see it, providing supplements, foam rollers, bands. It's everything for me anyway. And I think that's maybe where my experience, where I've talked to practitioners who have maybe been academies or clubs down south possibly, or in different countries where they're flush with resources, who can't believe that that's one person's job. Now, that makes it sound like I'm saying I'm a martyr and how amazing is it that I'm doing all this stuff. Not at all. But like you said, it does make you a generalist, and it gives you a good sort of broad set of skills, where I honestly don't think in the last 3 or 4 years, possibly longer, that I've necessarily become a much better practitioner. Like I'm really changing how I think about things and developing new skills as such, but something that I'm infinitely better at probably every single time I do it is just decision making. You're just making the decision quicker because of your exposure to the environment. You've seen so many things go right, so many things go wrong, so many different players with different requirements, whether that's nutritional, S&C, on pitch, recovery, all of those things. You're able to make a decision and react so much quicker. I think that's probably where I'm progressed.
So even like going back to when you were doing your PhD as well, like you talk about all the kind of resources you have like on camps. I know it's just you, but actually like GPS units, hydration monitoring, and everything like that. Compare that to what you were doing during your PhD in those performance schools. I bet like even the resources across the same organisation in 2 different environments were completely different as well.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the major drawbacks of my PhD, certainly one of them, is that we weren't able to quantify load in the research that we did. It was all based on volume, which, as we know, is, you could be on the pitch for 2 hours and not do very much. But it was the only thing we could do because we didn't have any GPS. We didn't have any way of quantifying load really reliably because it was across the whole country. It was 300 odd players with, 15, 16, 17 parent clubs as well. So there was information everywhere. And the performance programme was structured quite differently in that the Football Association run the performance programme and the parents still go back to the players go back to the parent clubs in the evening. So there's not too many countries that I'm aware of that do that. Usually it's massive clubs like Liverpool, Man City, so on, that are linked with their own school and they control the whole thing. Or it's a French model of Clairefontaine where they meet regularly somewhere like that, whereas we're talking daily basis in with the national programme in the morning and then back to parent club in the evening. So there could be information and data everywhere. It's so hard to control.
I think that's like a really unique thing. One is the unique thing about the Scottish performance schools, which we'll come back onto as well. But I think I always like to discuss about challenging with like students and stuff like that, and even practitioners. Because a lot of us have the perception of what we would go into in an environment, or we just adopt what is already there or what's already known. But if you go to like the performance schools when you're doing your PhD, you've got a blank canvas. There's nothing there.
Yeah.
So actually starting with just noting down how long they're training for is a basic entry level to sports science. And yes, we've got GPS, we've got biomarkers, we've got everything else now, but there's nothing wrong with actually just collecting duration and looking at volumes and tendencies of sessions in subjective as well. That is basic entry of sports science, would you agree? Or
yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, we did it as well because of the way the studies were structured. We were looking for control groups too. And we knew we were going to clubs and we were trying to do it on a sort of professional youth level as well as a grassroots level. So there was an acknowledgement that, we're not even using the equipment at the performance level, whatever that is. So why would we expect the control groups that we recruit at club level to have that? And then even more so, why would we expect grassroots level clubs to have that? So we had to come up with a way where we can monitor as consistently as possible across all the levels. And like you say, it was almost just like a player availability. So you had the opportunity to train for 2 hours this week, and all of that 2 hours, for whatever reason that might be, you were on the pitch for 40 minutes, for example. And that was all we had.
So thanks, Mike. And so thinking back to the performance schools and your PhD, obviously one of the main aims of that was to try and identify the better players and then give them like a higher level of support. So from your kind of studying and collaboration within the Scottish FA, how did it actually go about like utilising and monitoring talent ID within like the federation?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It's such a cop-out answer, but it's ongoing. I mean, we've so far, as a result of my PhD, which obviously is time limited. That's the other thing. You're looking to finish a PhD in 3 years, or I did it in just over that. And you don't have the time to sort of do the longitudinal side of that you want to do, because the players I was working with during those studies were 12 to 15, 12 to 16. So even the oldest ones, like if it was the oldest one in the whole study at the end of the PhD, was still only like 18 or 19 years old. So you don't have a huge time frame to sort of paint the longer term picture. You're only getting kind of little shorter term indications, and we kind of, as a result of the PhD work, which was all physical testing, so we were just trying to, part of that was to determine whether any sort of physical discriminators between the levels that I mentioned, like pro youth, performance, and then grassroots. And we found that, probably what you would expect, there was some in the performance sector that were faster than the ones in the pro youth. They were more able to change direction more readily, and they were kind of, both levels were better than the grassroots at that. So it's not really necessarily stuff that you wouldn't expect, but it kind of confirmed your suspicions. And then it asks that sort of age-old question, which I don't think anybody still knows the answer to, of, are they better because they're there, or are they there because they're better? it's a difficult one to answer, you know. So we looked at those sorts of things. We also looked at how baseline influences performance or influences change in physical development, I should say. And we found that when we tried to determine was it whether the players were becoming biologically more mature during the time periods between testing, was it how long they spent on the pitch in the time periods between testing, or was it just their baseline? The baseline was actually the biggest predictor of how much better people became at the physical tests. So I suppose that's quite telling for how we prescribe training as well, because that suggests to me that it's the ones with the worst baseline scores that actually stand to get better during the time frame. So we need to be careful if we're going to rank order players, because that's what coaches always say. They always say who's the fastest, who's the quickest, who jumped the highest. And that's a very subjective thing for them in their head of if that player's at the bottom of that pile, well, they're really struggling. Whereas the other ones that actually have the greatest opportunity for change. But not only that, tells me that the ones who are at the top of that list, the ones who are the fastest and are the quickest, aren't necessarily becoming that much better between the time points. Are we holding them back? Is it like a regression to the mean, where you can only train as strongly as your weakest quote unquote member? So I think from talent ID perspective, that gave us some interesting stuff to work with. It gave us an idea of who we might want to try and indicate or try and identify for the coming years. But the problem was, from the SFA's point of view, they were bringing players in first and then testing them. So the recruitment was happening entirely subjectively. And then the players had a 4-year commitment, which I totally agree with. I think it's excellent that you can't be released other than things like behaviour and for other reasons. It's not football related to release players during the programme. So I do agree with that side. But if you're going to bring them in first of all, then test them, what do you do if the testing says indication is that we maybe shouldn't have recruited that player? So we've sort of stripped that back a stage, and now to the point where we're at in the last 5 years, actually collecting physical data at the national trial. So at the final hurdle before players are offered or not offered places, we were taking some physical data to try and determine were there any differences between the ones who were offered places and the ones who weren't. And then we've, in the last 3 years, managed to take that a stage further, where we felt we had absolutely maximised the physical testing side. Isolating, doing the test battery with young kids on a day like that maybe wasn't the best way to go about it. And we were able to bring in Player Maker and actually start looking at technical metrics and on-the-ball actions, and to see if there was any discriminating factors between who was selected and who wasn't, depending on a sort of much more ecologically valid environment, if you ask me.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, sorry, there was a bit of noise in my background for some reason. So yeah, it's a really interesting kind of journey that like you guys have been on with regards to talent ID, and actually there's elements of like sports science, like case studies and evolution within that as well, and shows how it's progressing. It has been a successful model as well. There have been players that have come through this like performance schools model and gone on to be professional players as well. There's a couple of good examples, but yeah, I suppose, what do you think? You asked the question yourself, like, for those players who have been successful parts of the program, do you think that was because of the program, or were they always destined to be that? And how can we as sports scientists help spot? And I suppose we'll go on to your recent research paper as well, like after this as well.
Yeah, it's just the ball stuff a lot of the time, isn't it? I mean, there are some fantastic examples of players who have come through the programme, both the women's and the men's side. Emma Watson playing for the women's A squad, Lauren Davidson playing for the women's A, Billy Gilmore, Nathan Patterson on the men's side, and all with very different journeys. And I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying that. And I think everybody expects that, to be honest. I think we're at a stage with the understanding of biological maturation and timing and tempo of growth, and we understand that the journey's not linear, and that I think to the point you made of how sports science supports that is almost to rein, that sounds bad, but rein coaches in and to remind coaches of that, exactly that person's journey's going to be entirely different, and sometimes physical testing plays a part in that. Sometimes that's because of anthropometric measures that we can take, and we can estimate where they are in the growth curve, and we can do percentage of adult stature now, and that's again more commonly accepted. That sort of stuff. When I started, it was methods that maybe weren't great. They weren't hugely reliable, whereas they're getting better. There's fantastic research now available, sort of openly available calculators for how to get this information yourself. For players, you don't always need sports scientists, but I think it's the sports scientist's job to almost bring all the information back in and just help the coaches to understand where players are at. And I'm talking about young players, I'm talking about players who are developing. Because if I used Billy and Nathan as two different examples, it was blatantly obvious when you watched Billy at 9 or 10 that he was absolutely incredible. He was a great footballer and he was the best in the group and stuff like that. So he had a very, very different path to Nathan.
Was Billy the best physically, by the way, out of curiosity, at those ages?
I wouldn't know without going back and looking exactly. He always had good
scores. Stood out.
Yeah. Oh, you could see technically, and his understanding and his movement on the pitch was miles ahead of where everyone else was at. Good physical scores, but he's an interesting one as well that I always think about, and similar players when we talk about it, and I think we're going to talk about it later on, where people will talk about different game formats and bio-banding and where people should be, because players like that, I think, are done a disservice to by game formats like that, where sometimes the worst thing you can do for a smaller player who's technically very good and willing to, go in where it hurts and a hard day and work hard. I think sometimes the worst thing you can do is take them out of there and put them against players their own size, because they need to struggle a little bit. They have to have as long as they can sort of psychologically and mentally cope with it, which him as an example was never an issue. I think we're too quick to jump the gun sometimes and say, do bio-banding, that would fix it. So, yeah, I think just and again, it's going back to being an all-rounder, but I think the practitioner's responsibility is just to try and create some sort of something that makes sense from all the information, because all the information's confusing as it is to us. So to coaches that don't study it and haven't studied it, it's even more confusing.
Which I suppose that brings us on nicely. So what we've done as part of the podcast is ask the guests to either recommend the paper or discuss a paper that they've done recently with regards to it as well. So this is the beauty of having a multi-platform kind of podcast where, one, if you're listening to this, we'll have to describe it very well, but if you're looking at this visually, you'll be able to see one of Mike's recent papers shared as well. So, which is, funny enough, with the talent idea, the performance schools as well, looking at the multidisciplinary approach. So, do you want to give a brief intro to it, Mike, and like how you came up with that? Because we kind of had a bit of a background about the paper already, really, but it'd be good to see how you got to this point and using that multidisciplinary approach to this kind of process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, we've kind of touched on it already, where we went through a process of completely subjective assessment during talent ID at the Football Association to then going through the subjective selection, then testing doesn't necessarily make sense to, right, let's do some testing at the sort of final trial level. And then we've kind of moved that on again to this national trial where, the Football Association have been brilliant in accommodating and being willing to try this sort of stuff, because to the best of my knowledge, it's not something that happens in in other parts of the world necessarily that might be versions of it, but it's not that common, certainly for a national programme, to go through a stage like this where we got to a point where they still have regional trials, but there is one day, almost like a kind of NFL combine, where the grand plan was bring all the successful players from the initial trials together in the one place. You're left with somewhere in the region of 90 to 100 young players, and then put them through a battery of tests. So was mentioned already, an isolated sort of physical test battery where we looked at very common measures that we had done for the previous years about sprints and change of direction and jump heights, and did some anthropometric measures. And then also to use the player maker technology, try and get some information from match play, something that I'm certainly not aware has been done, to try and take some metrics from match play, small-sided games, things that are uncoached, where the players are just put into teams and left to play, to try and discriminate whether or not, basically, who was being offered places and who wasn't. Were there any factors within the test battery or the match play that were indicative of why we were actually picking certain players? So that was all part of a conversation in the background, and then, as I say, the SFA were incredibly supportive in allowing us to come in and do that.
How did you find the coaches' receptiveness to that? I know you obviously said, like, when you first established the physical kind of testing part of your PhD, that was like challenge. But given the evolution of the program, given the multidisciplinary approach to this aspect of talent ID, were they more accommodating? Because I'm guessing previously they would have just watched the games and picked the best players as well.
Yeah, honestly, and I'm not just saying this, but fantastic, like absolutely fantastic. And it might just be because it's a certain crop of coaches, but so willing to give it a chance, really interested, particularly, I think, more so by the use of the player maker technology, because they maybe were coming to the end of their tether with the isolated test battery stuff. And I think one of the recommendations, which we might go on to talk about, came out of the paper was maybe the fact that we now, having been able to use the player maker technology, don't necessarily need the isolated test battery. So I think when we started those kind of conversations where they could actually sort of see a tangible use for the information, where they were saying, well, because we've allowed him to go through that process, we're now actually going to get back some of the time because we might do away with that part that we didn't actually like. So I think very receptive, but only really because we were able to show the benefits of it.
So because of the findings from that research paper, because again, sometimes as sports scientists, we see loads of papers published, and sometimes you go, well, so what? What's the findings from that, and how does that actually impact performance? Like,
yeah,
I know you might be presenting this at the next year's World Conference of Science and Soccer, as we spoke about before the call as well, which we'll get onto in a bit as well. But how have you found that, like, the findings from that research paper have now influenced your, or the Scottish FA's kind of talent ID, like, kind of recruitment talent processes?
So I think they've had quite a big influence. I mean, for one, we've removed the isolated physical test battery, so that's a pretty significant step, considering that was something that was pretty much a staple. It was in there, and I suppose everybody thought we need to do it, and that's probably just because it's what we'd always done, which is dangerous road to go down. But that was taken out because we noted that the coaches and the scouts and the decision makers were actually able to pick out the quote unquote best players. So the data wasn't used to select the players. The data was analysed retrospectively to determine whether any discriminating factors. And when we did that, we noted that the players who were offered places in the programme who were successful on the day were the ones who ran faster, jumped higher, changed direction more readily in the isolated test battery. And they were also the ones that ran further, run faster, and changed direction more readily in the match play. So we thought, well, we're almost testing the same thing twice, but in doing that, we're taking up a whole chunk of a morning or afternoon to do an isolated test battery that's not that enjoyable. I mean, I always try and go back to the fact that these are little kids. They're like 11 and 12-year-old little kids who are dead nervous and they just want to play football. And they've got a chance to get into a national programme and they might get in and some of their mates might get in and they might not. And it's a tough time for them. So I think that the isolated test battery in that sense might be a little bit false on occasion. There's nerves to that. There's learning effect. Some of them done it before and some of them haven't. Whereas when the ball's rolling and you're in the game, I would think that's a much more, as I said earlier, ecologically valid way of determining how fast someone is or how able they are to change direction. But on top of that, get the technical metrics as well.
Yeah, I suppose it comes back to that point of Usain Bolt isn't the best football player in the world. Like, I know he's probably not as quick as what he once was, but he's still probably quicker than most football players anyway. But yeah, I like that analogy, and I suppose that's where it's great to hear about how, even kind of from your early practitioner days, like your kind of thinking's evolved into a more of a multidisciplinary approach, which is what sports science in general is becoming. Like, we've got that, what you kind of teach the students at university, that entry level basic principles of sports science practice, like your physiology, your biomechanics and so on, but it does turn a lot more multidisciplinary like the further up you go, and we have to help educate the stakeholders alongside our coaches.
Absolutely. And I think when I worked in football full time, I remember a practitioner saying to me, and it's honestly stuck with me still, I still think about it. He used to say, remember on Saturday it's not 11v11 sports sides, it's football we're playing. So, more likely than not, the people with the best footballers are going to win. So it sort of takes you back to make you makes you question, well, why are we doing that? Why exactly are we doing that? And I know that's maybe more performance driven than it is long-term athlete development. But we're trying to find the best footballers, or the ones that we think can turn into the best footballers. An element of it is kind of crystal ball stuff, and we won't know for probably another 5 years. We've got a bank of data there that's going to give us an indication of some short-term success, but we don't want them to be successful at 15, 16, 17, really. It's great if they are, but we want to find the ones who can be successful at 22, 23, 24 and walk out as a starter at the Euros, at the World Cup and so on. And that's the ones that we want to see. And it's tough. Still don't know if we can do it.
Exactly. That. And before we go on to the education side, because you made some really good points about educating people, which I know you've been doing some work on the new UEFA fitness modules as well, but just coming back to that point, like, what strategies now long-term have you guys got in place to try and keep an eye on those highlighted talented players to then make it there? Is there, you said before there wasn't anything in place, like, other than counting minutes. Have you adapted or changed those kind of methods to have a better understanding of what talented players would look like or their journeys?
Yeah, so one of the things that sort of really significant change that following the success, I suppose, of the revamp of the trial and the use of the player maker technology was to use the player maker tech every day in the programme. So the Scottish FA, again, incredibly supportive, signed a partnership with Player Maker to have every player who's part of the performance school programme assigned to an individual unit that they can use on a daily basis. So we have data coming in every single day from players who are on the pitch. So we do have an indication of, okay, things that are maybe physical and distances and high intensity distances, fine. Less interested in them probably now. Still of interest, but not a huge concern to me. Maybe more looking at, touches on the ball, and because that was something that was sort of commonly spoken about and just accepted thing almost when the performance school very first started, with this 10,000 hours volume at doing stuff. That's what's going to make you an expert, 10,000 hours. Now, over the course of the last decade, that's kind of been talked down. It's not commonly accepted anymore. It's pretty much debunked. People don't use it, and if someone does, it's very quickly sort of jumped on. So we're almost trying to think of something different. Can we get, I don't know what it is. I honestly don't know what it is. We have to try and find something that is going to indicate, or if it can indicate how successful someone is in the short, medium and long term. Now that might be technical. It might be touches of the ball. It might be possessions of the ball. It might be the amount of time you spend on the ball in match play. We don't know. But the fact is now that we're going to have a much better idea, because as that information continues to roll in, players are continually selected for national level or go on to professional contracts or go on to senior appearances. We're going to have a bank of information that's going to suggest, well, the ones who went on to 50 senior appearances did X. Or it might be that there's no difference at all, but the thing I think with that is sometimes that's all right, but you need to try and find out. It's okay if, we do this for 10 years and don't find anything, because then we will know that there's no technical discriminating factors, there's no physical discriminating factors, there's nothing that we've tested for the last 15 to 20 years that indicates the likelihood of someone going from 11 years old to being a professional A-squad player at men's or women's level. Nothing that we've tested. And then I suppose you move on to the next thing, whatever that is.
Which is fascinating. We still, all these years of sports science, it's still a relatively new field as well, isn't it? In the grand scheme of science in general.
Yeah.
But we've still got a lot of way to go in talent ID. We're hopefully getting better methods, but we still can't prove it.
It's hard because everybody wants the answers yesterday, don't they? They all want to know who's the best player going to be. Tell me so we can invest, or so, and that creates problems as well, because there's so many issues created by the players who go on to be a success, and they're the ones that have the story of released at 15 because they were too small, and look at them now, they've won the Champions League. So clubs then will go, right, wait a minute, hot house, don't release them, keep them in, don't let them go, because look what happened. But unfortunately, it's probably the releasing of the player that creates the Champions League winner. So I think we have to think more holistically, multidisciplinary about it doesn't then make sense to, right, okay, well, if that's the formula, bring a kid in, feed them with all hope, and then shatter their dreams in the hope that they become a Champions League winner. That is not ethical, and you would never do it. But there's got to be a way we can sort of replicate that sort of struggle and adversity, and teach them to cope and expose them to different environments, technically, physically, whether it's game formats, whether it's training up, training down, whatever it is. I'm not entirely sure, but there's got to be a way we can do it.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, and more education probably to the world is better, which probably brings us on to the last couple of topics of the podcast as well. So again, you've been doing some good work, obviously, not just within the lecturing and educating of your students as well, but you're also part of the pilot project for UEFA. It'd be great to hear fitness UEFA, I should say. Sorry.
Yeah.
It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that. And then you're also on the board of the World Conference of Science and Soccer in 2025 as well. So you're a busy man as well, Mike.
I know, actually, seeing you say all these things, I forget doing them.
Yeah. So there you go. And you still haven't got time to play guitar in this episode, so I'm a bit disappointed.
I know, I need something to take my mind off it.
There you go. So it'd be great to hear a bit about what UEFA are doing to try and help educate practitioners better, whether that just be the senior on the field, or is there actually content like what we just talked about to Warren?
Yeah, I mean, the UEFA, the move from UEFA to create a licensed course for fitness coaches or sports scientists, whatever they want to call them, I believe, honestly, and it's not just because I'm involved in it, maybe it helps that I am, but I believe it's a good move. I think there has to be something at some point, because BASIS is great and it does give you a mark of accreditation. It's a sort of sign of your quality of work, and that you're an accredited practitioner. Brilliant. But I think we still come under the same problem of, it's not a protected term. Pretty much anybody can call themselves a sports scientist or a fitness coach, and nobody can say, no, you're not, because apparently I am one, and I have, role title descriptors to prove that. But I'm not entirely sure exactly what makes me that compared to someone else who just calls themselves that. So I think the idea is really good. I think we have to get to a point where there's an accreditation or a quality mark that means people have to have that to be where they are. And of course, that's going to ruffle some feathers. There are practitioners in the field, as I mentioned right at the start, who are far more experienced than me, far better at the job than me, have seen more things and done more things than I have done, and don't have that qualification. but are still very good at the job. But we have to start somewhere. And I think creating a similar pathway to what coaches have is a good way to do it. So, the notion that eventually to be a sports scientist, to be named as a sports scientist as part of a staff team, you'll have to have these accreditations. I think it's a good one. I think it's an essential step that probably was going to come sooner or later. It's always going to upset some people. But the creation of the course was interesting because we were the first ones to do it. We were chosen as part of the pilot programme, and we were the first governing body association to run a full programme. So it's been really interesting, really good, very enjoyable, and kind of difficult to know exactly how it's gone. I mean, we've finished the first cohort, we got some feedback. Some of it was good, some of it was constructive, nothing negative really, but really good candidates. And I genuinely believe that the courses that you go on vocationally, and even sometimes academically, the courses that you do are made by the people that you do it with. I've always thought when I was doing my coaching licenses, there was nothing wrong with the tutors, but you learned more from the candidates than you did from the tutors. You learned more by the group discussion and watching people deliver and talking about practice and what club are you at and where have you been and who do you know that I know. You got more out of that sometimes than what the tutors were delivering. That's an essential part of it because you need to know about assignments. You have to know about how the course runs and the sort of topics that they cover. But what you actually take from it, to me, was more about the other people you were on it with. So I think if people sort of viewed it that way as a sort of networking opportunity, a chance to meet other practitioners, because it's really not something that happens that often. You don't often get practitioners in the same space. Practitioners spend more time talking to coaches and managers and, other disciplines. They do actually talking to their own discipline. I find certainly so. I think it's really good for that. The course has so far been a success. There'll absolutely be little bits that will tweak and change, but really good, and some top quality candidates. And when we spoke about it as a team of tutors who were going to deliver it, we were very firm on the idea that this is not us teaching. It's not slide after slide after slide. We'll teach you about this topic. We'll teach you about what good periodisation is, and we'll show you how to analyse GPS data. It's very much an open forum. And okay, you work at this club in Romania. You work at a club in Croatia. You work here, there, everywhere. How do you do it? Tell us. Then we'll talk about what the positives and the negatives of that are. You might pick up something for someone else. It's far more discussive and interactive than it is slide after slide after slide. We wanted to avoid that because, as I mentioned, the three of us that deliver it are not the best practitioners in the world. We just want to facilitate conversations and discussions with people who are the best practitioners in the world. So that's kind of how we've approached it.
Because once you got to a certain level of understanding principles of sports science and the foundations of it, that's where actually the application is where the networking really does start to pay dividends and support your own personal philosophies as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting again, people like basis of the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science and UKCA will actually ask you what is your personal philosophy. So what you just described there is a really good example of actually people developing their personal philosophies through conversations after the education.
Yeah.
I suppose, again, another good education opportunity which we see, so we're both heavily excited about this event and stuff like that. It's the World Congress of Science and Soccer as well. So for anyone that's within the football and soccer world, depending on where you're from as well, it'd be good just to get a bit of a overview of what you're trying to do with the World Conference this coming year in 2025, Mike, as well, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an interesting story to how it was born out in Coimbra.
Yeah.
I was sort of...
You're bullied.
I won't say, but I'd say cajoled into believing that it was appropriate to put a bid together to host it.
When you talk about networking, obviously that's a prime example right there where I remember being sat around that table with yourself, a few others, key person Barry Just as well. I think yeah, Barry picked up the phone to a colleague of yours and just basically said, you're running the conference. Mike said he'd do it. And then that was it, I think, wasn't it?
That was it. That was how it happened. I think I'd met Barry once in passing before, but never actually had a full conversation with him. Found myself sitting at dinner with him. He was asking me what I was getting up to. He said, do you know they still don't have someone to host it? And then we were doing the usual, do you know this person, do you know that person? So he took it upon himself to message a former colleague of mine and say, Mike's just had a great idea. You guys are going to put together a bid. And I thought, I didn't even know I had that idea. But exactly that. Again, more out of the people that are there than sometimes the content itself. But we found ourselves in the sort of competition to host the World Congress of Science and Soccer 2025. And we were very fortunate to be awarded it. So that is, as part of my old institution at the University of West of Scotland, there, the host institution, along with Professor Vishwanathan and Reader Antonio Dello Iacoro. So we are, Antonio and I, the co-chairs, and Vish is the chair. The Congress is going to take place across Ibrox Stadium, Celtic Park, and also Hampden Park, with Rangers, Celtic and the Scottish FA as partners in the conference. Something quite different as well. I know I've spoken quite a lot about trying to be different. It's not always good to be different, but I like to try and shake things up a little bit. Rather than having one conference venue, was to try and entice people to Scotland by showing them, I suppose, the three things that everybody thinks about when they think about football in Scotland: the Old Firm stadiums and the National Stadium. So getting to see all three of those is a fantastic opportunity, in my opinion, and I've been there hundreds of times to all of them. And I still look forward to going back. So we've got that June 2025. We're slowly building a programme. We've got keynotes sort of confirmed. We've got some sponsorship coming in. We are in the process of just trying to keep everything ticking over. But you can now submit abstracts. You can register for the conference. All that stuff's open. You can find them on social media and follow the build-up to the Congress as well. So
I suppose
really
the final point about the conference, you started talking about understanding what sports science is and how it's evolved, like kind of in your field, I suppose, like just to show the detail now that sports science goes into different worlds. What kind of topics are actually getting presented, or kind of different buckets of sports science are being presented at the World Conference of Science and Soccer, please?
Yeah, so we really have tried to capture everything. So we've got, of course, the usual ones, because they're absolutely still relevant, sort of strength and conditioning and biomechanics and talent identifications in there as well. But we also have tried and made a real conscious effort with the Congress to show the sort of more social science side, to introduce psychology, more sort of psychology sessions, to also think about societal impact that football has, sport has, on the broader community. So those are very much a part of it as well, an equal part of it, to be added into the usual ones, because of course everybody wants to, the flashy stuff. And like you said, you say sports science, everyone thinks GPS. It'll be there, and it's still important. It's important we talk about it. But there will be, hopefully, an addition of some things that maybe aren't as common as other ones. We've also made a very conscious effort throughout the programme to allow the partners, Celtic, Rangers and the Scottish FA, to allow their foundations to speak, the charities that they're associated with to speak, to show, the impact that football has on, as I say, the broader society, how they use football to target local community and different aspects of society. So we're very conscious of trying to tie that in, alongside the more traditional topics that everybody, of course, wants to hear about.
Brilliant. Thank you, mate. And I suppose as a summary point, because we've discussed like quite a large topic, we've gone from just application of sports science across the early stages of sports science, like as a practitioner from the performance schools to your national team work, to lecturing and educating students as well, all the way through to what you're doing now with the performance schools, and then all the way through to how there's better education within sports science, I would say, from the applied field. So kind of like as a summary point for you, Mike, it'd be good to see what would you want the the audience or the listeners to take away with regards to talent ID and sports science to summarise the call?
I think probably more patience required. We have to try and wait longer for the answers, and we have to try and convince coaches of why we're doing that. I think sometimes we're too quick to jump the gun. I know I certainly have been about when you think you've found the silver bullet, you think you've found the thing, and you stop looking elsewhere. So I think, unfortunately, sometimes looking for the answers that you don't want tells you just as much as the things that you do want to find. As I mentioned before, if we do what we're doing currently with technical analysis, daily technical analysis for another 5 years and find out it's not telling us anything, that's all right. That is okay. It's annoying. Of course it's annoying. That's not what I want to happen, but it is okay, because we'll just look somewhere else. So I think probably try and broaden our horizons a wee bit. Try and look for things, look in places that other people haven't looked. And it's hard because, the ones that everyone did physical testing because it was easier to do. You could get the equipment, you could get people to run physical testing, it was objective. At least you had a definitive number, score, whatever. That's why people did it. They didn't really do technical analysis because they didn't have the technology. Now we do, using player makers, fantastic. We're not sure if it's going to work. And then the only things left after that, possibly things like cognitive testing, psychological profiling, screening. Certainly not my bag, but someone has to do it if it comes to it. Would be really interesting.
Cheers, thank you, Mike. I appreciate the time you've given us to the podcast, and appreciate the time as always. We'll make all the relevant resources available to the listeners after the chat. So a link to the paper that Mike talked about, also links to the UEFA pilot discussion that Mike will speak about, and also links to the World Conference of Science and Soccer in Glasgow 2025 as well. Thank you again for your time, Mike, and cheers to the listeners for listening. You've been listening to the Sports Science Insights with me, Steve Barrett, and guest Mike King.